Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. This is Omar Dexter again from the UK, and joining me all the way from Australia again is Brother Musa Ser Antonio. I'm going to talk a little bit about history to start with, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you, Brother Omar. Inshallah, decided we're going to take a look at some examples throughout Islamic history, and anyone who's really looked into Islamic history would know there's such a vast amount of rich resources to look at as Muslims. The Muslims, have been people who weren't just isolated into the Arabian Peninsula. They spread out throughout the world, looking at their interactions, how they spread Islam, how they dealt with people, battles that took place. It's really amazing to look at these and to benefit from it, because there's so many amazing lessons to be learnt in them. Mainly, I'm hoping to look at, inshallah, first of all, looking at the history of Al-Andalus. And I'm sure you'd know Al-Andalus.
Spain.
Yes, basically Islamic Spain, all of the Iberian Peninsula. And it's interesting to look, first of all, a lot of people, they're not really too sure, how did such a vast expanse of land come under the rule of the Muslims? How did Islam enter into the peninsula?
I think some people think that Islam spread by the sword.
It's commonly perceived, a lot of people would think, the Muslims just sort of pushed their way through like barbaric people, but of course this actually wasn't the case.
Not at all.
We see with the case of Al-Andalus, what actually happened, looking at the politics of the time, you basically had the Visigoth Empire who had pushed down into Western Europe, and they had forced their form of religion, which was Catholicism, onto the local people. Now the local people of Spain, they were essentially a form of Christianity which was known as Arianism. Now within Arianism, we can't say that they were completely monotheistic, but essentially they did believe that God was one, and Jesus, peace be upon him, was a man, a prophet, and he was not divine. Now the Visigoths...
Interesting, yeah.
It's very interesting to see that there were Christians who were calling to this. Basically...
At that time.
Yes, around that time. And the Visigoths, understandably being Catholic, they didn't like this. So they started to force their own beliefs upon the local people. Now the local people, they had no one to really call upon. They were sort of pushed down into the pocket of Europe with no one to help. So they looked beyond the Mediterranean Sea, and you had the Muslims who were in North Africa at the time. Now, as Muslims were being monotheistic people, they had that link in common. They actually felt closer to the Muslims than to people who also called themselves Christians.
And of course, that's not the first times that the Muslims have fought for other people's rights. Not just the Muslims, fought for other religions' rights to have the freedom to worship their own religion.
Indeed, and when the Muslims were invited as such, the Christians, the Arian Christians, had said to the Muslims, please come liberate us, because we're being oppressed. And as you said, yes, the Muslims were eager to go help them in this situation. The catalyst for what led to this, it's an interesting story. There's a territory in northern Africa, just above Morocco, and it's still actually part of Spain. It's called the Kingdom of Ceuta.
Okay.
And the king of Ceuta at this time, he had actually sent his daughter to go to Spain. She was the princess, to go study in Spain under the king at the time. Now what actually happened, historical accounts relate that the king actually he raped the leader of Ceuta. Understandably, he was quite upset by this. So
anybody in their right mind is going to be more than upset about it.
Of course you'd
have every right to.
You'd be hell-bent on revenge after such a thing.
Yeah. Anybody of any religion.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So what happened was this king of Ceuta, he was, angered by what had happened, and as well the politics at the time were very tense, and the people of Ceuta really, they wanted to free themselves of the oppression of the Visigoth Empire of Spain. So what happened, this king of Ceuta, he basically said to the Muslims, look, here's the affair, here's what I want to do, here's the boats, here's the weapons, let's go.
So it wasn't Muslims fighting the non-Muslims, it was people being oppressed, asking for the Muslims to help them.
On one front, yes, you had the Christians of Spain who were wanting to be liberated. They were saying to the Muslims, come help us. Then you had this king who was saying, look, I'll facilitate everything. I've got my own grudges against this other Christian king. And so he came to the Muslims to try and resolve things for the best for himself. So he basically gave the Muslims everything they need. And the Muslims of North Africa, they contacted the Khalifa, who at that time was in Syria. And they said to the Khalifa, we want to go into the peninsula. And they hadn't really said, we want to take the place. And the Khalifa, what he said was, go in, take a look, scope the situation out.
Make an assessment, like an intelligence mission.
Yeah, make a reconnaissance mission, see how things are, and then we'll make some more decisions.
But notice the etiquette. They check with their leader. This wasn't a bunch of barbarians saying, guys, let's jump on a ship and let's go.
No, of
They
course
checked
not.
with the leader and waited for authority.
Indeed. And this Khalifa wasn't just a Khalifa, again, who was isolated in Syria. He was the Khalifa of what was much of the Muslim empire at that time.
Okay.
So once he had given this go-ahead, the Muslims, they pushed up into southern Spain, in the area which is now known as Andalusia, which comes from the name Al-Andalus, which was the name given to the peninsula by the Muslims. And what they did is they found very little resistance. There was only a small band of them. They didn't have, their entire army. A few Berbers came in under the command of a general whose name was Tarik ibn Ziyad. And this General Tarik is an amazing general. If we could really put a bit more time in just to look at the etiquette, the wonders of this man, it would be amazing. But one historical note that's interesting about him is there's a small island which is in the Mediterranean, just at the tip of Africa and where Spain comes down. And this island, at modern day, it's known as Gibraltar.
Gibraltar, yeah.
Yes, as you'd know. And Gibraltar actually gets its name from this general, because when he went there, they named the place after him Jebel Tariq, which in Arabic means the mountain of Tariq. Now, Jebel Tariq over time has become Gibraltar.
Got it.
So even we've got this island, it's a prime location within the Mediterranean, named
Very
after.
strategic position, yeah.
Yeah, it's highly sought after, named after this great Muslim general.
Right.
So what Tarik ibn Ziyad did, he had mostly Berber troops, and Berbers are the native North Africans. You'll find that around Morocco, Algeria, and they pushed up into the peninsula. And what happened, as I said, they faced very little resistance. If anything, they were actually welcomed once they arrived.
If the people there have been oppressed, they're going to welcome someone to come in to liberate them.
Indeed, they were happy to see them. But, of course, the king of Spain at that time, the Visigoth king, he sent his troops down, and they did fight. They had a battle, and the Muslims really took them very, very easily. And it's narrated that what happened, there's some debate between Muslim historians and the non-Muslim historians to the veracity of this account, but nevertheless it's interesting to look at. What actually happened was once they had reached Spain, General Tarik, he said to his troops, behind you is the ocean, and ahead is the enemy. And what he'd done is this is where there's a bit of a dispute, he actually had the ship burnt.
So he was pretty much set on his resolve on what his mission was.
He was saying, yes, there's no turning back from here. And so they pushed forward and they took this enemy, and it was amazing. What actually happened was, even though they were outmanned, they were outnumbered, the Spanish were the vast majority. When this battle was over, they had, one Muslim would have about 20, 30 of the prisoners tied up. So it was amazing, the result in this. And of course, Allah was the one who aided them in this.
There's an old expression that says, one volunteer is worth 10 pressed men. So I guess
Indeed.
if people are forced into battle by a dictator, they're not going to have the same level of commitment and resolve as what somebody who's actually doing it with the right intention, who, basically to liberate people, as anyone would want to do for their brothers and sisters.
Of course, indeed, you're right on that. And the Muslims were there for a sincere reason. They weren't being forced by anyone.
That's right.
And so after this initial battle, what happened was the Muslims pushed up north. And you have to understand, again, this was only a force that was sent to scope out the situation. Nothing more.
Like a small team, part of the army.
Yes, a small team. And they pushed up and they went from village to village. And they found, again, either there was no resistance at all, or there was only a tiny amount of resistance. And in this area, especially in southern Spain, you actually had a lot of Jews living there at the time. And the Jews, like the monotheistic Christians, were heavily oppressed because of their beliefs. So the Jews were happy. They were happy to have the Muslims coming in because, they were replacing the oppressors that came before them. And they saw a hope in the Muslims.
Well, throughout history, you've often had Muslims and Jews living in peace next door to each other, in the same town, integrated together.
Indeed. And the Muslims, what they did was when they would take a town, what they would do, because they didn't have the men to stay behind and look after it, because they wanted to keep on pushing forward, they'd actually leave the Jews of the city to look after it. They'd be in charge of the place until the Muslims had come back. So there was this cooperation between them.
It must have been a big level of trust.
There was a level of trust, but it was also a need. The Jews needed the Muslims to remained in the peninsula and to succeed, and the Muslims needed the Jews to look after it so they could continue pushing on. Now, at this time, General Tarik, he had his commands to not continue pushing on forward.
Okay.
Now, we're not sure exactly why. It might have been something personal, or just might have been his own desire for pushing on. but he kept on going up. And it's amazing just how much this small band of people, they were able to take basically all of the Iberian Peninsula. They had pushed up until the Pyrenees Mountains, which is just bordering France, and then they sort of pushed back a bit. Now, when the Khalifa had heard about this, he said, well, it's not what I wanted.
But now you've done it.
But yeah, you've done it, so we might as well consolidate it.
I guess the feeling was a feeling of a sense of having fulfilled part of their religious duty, in that if you hear your brothers are oppressed, you have to basically go to their aid with whatever you can, inshallah.
Indeed, and of course there's the fact that they're spreading the banner of Islam, they're spreading the message of Islam. You know, parts of Central Europe who would have known nothing about Islam, now all of a sudden you've got Islam coming across and the message is spreading.
And probably spread very rapidly and welcomely by the people. I mean, if you was liberated, wouldn't you have a good feeling towards your liberators?
Of course. And you'll find that many of the Christians who, you know, saw the Muslims, especially because they already had that monotheistic belief, when Islam was brought to them, they had no grudges against it. They said, we're willing to submit. This is basically, we're happy with it.
Alhamdulillah, they recognised the truth when it was presented to them.
Indeed. Now, around this time, once the Muslims had stopped at this area, they had, you know, received all their reinforcements, troops coming from Syria, all from around northern Africa, and they had a really big push. And it culminated in a battle at a place in France which is called Tours. Now, this battle was really, it's amazing when you look at the enormity, the immense size of the two armies. Now, I think in this time it was actually the Muslims who had the majority. And it's strange that usually when you look through Islamic history, when the Muslims have the smaller amount, they usually succeed. When they have the larger amount, it's strange, maybe it's the confidence, maybe it could be a number of things.
It's often the case that God is with the smaller group who is on the truth. And they are steadfast, and throughout all the odds, they come out victorious. Time after time after time.
And indeed, in this case, it was no exception. When the Muslims had the majority, they met the French forces, who at that time, they weren't actually French, they were called the Frankish forces, and they met at this one place. And if you look at what the European historians say, they say this battle basically was the battle for Europe. Had the Muslims taken this town, they would have pushed on, because Europe had put all of their defense into this one battle. Had the Muslims taken that, it would have collapsed the Europeans, and Islam
past it.
Islam would have went straight through and conquered all of Europe. And unfortunately...
liberated.
Liberated, yes.
These are like small kingdoms.
Of course, yeah, Europe is nothing like...
fragmented at the time.
At that time, it's nothing like Europe was now.
Yeah.
So they met at that battle, and there's a number of things of what happened. One of the things was the Muslims are very concerned about looking after the treasures that they had. So because of this, the Frankish forces actually... in advance had planned for this to happen. They wanted the Muslims to worry about their treasures so they could get in for a surprise attack.
Maybe it's a test from Allah.
Indeed. We know that this happened similarly in the Battle of Uhud, where the Muslims were concerned about the treasures of the battle and they were racing to go towards them.
That's right.
And they had broken their commands. So we say history is repeating itself.
But I guess people fall for the same old tricks. It's like the whispering from the Satan. Same tricks, different situations, but it's the same methodology, like the deception, combining something which is frankly a lie with something which is true, and making it overall polluted.
Indeed, and unfortunately as the Muslims, they fell for this. Through this, or through a number of reasons, they were defeated. So they basically had stopped at the natural border of the Pyrenees Mountains. Now from there, all of the Iberian Peninsula, except a small pocket in the northwestern area, remained Muslim, and the Christians were pushed up into that one area. And for the rest of the history of Al-Andalus, the Christians remained there, and the Muslims never took that. Although they did have skirmishes and battles throughout those, the time that they were there, that area remained Christian. Had they taken that, history would have been a lot different to how it would have turned out now.
Maybe it's the will of Allah is meant to be this way for some reason.
Basically what had happened was, for 800 years, that area became known as Al-Andalus. The exact meaning of Al-Andalus, there's a lot of debate over what it meant, but basically what it means is the Iberian Peninsula, which is Spain and Portugal, as we know it today. Now, at the time, the Muslims, unlike other places where they went to, they didn't impose all of their culture onto them. For example, the language of the people still remained Spanish. Although the Muslims would have spoken Arabic, the main language, even the Muslims were speaking, it was Spanish. What's interesting, however, at that time, Spanish was actually written with the Arabic alphabet, and much of the Arabic...
Didn't know that.
Yeah, if you look at some documents, you'll see Spanish written in Arabic letters. It's amazing.
Wow.
And of course, a lot of the language, naturally with the Muslims being in charge of the land, had an influence on the Spanish language. And for anyone who knows Spanish, even the sounds of it, you've got a lot of kha, tha, and all of these leads,
that's right, yeah,
which only exist in Arabic. They're not natural European sounds. So this is what came from the Muslims.
Right.
And even linguists will say that up to 10,000 words in the Spanish language have Arabic origins. And many of them actually entered into English from there. So they had an amazing effect, you know, just whether it be in their language, whether it be in the culture, the cuisine, especially if you go to southern Spain, still today, they eat much like the Arabs.
And some people say, and what have the Muslims ever done for us? They don't know their history books.
Indeed. And to look at that, this is one of the most important things. If you look at within the Jewish religion, they actually refer to the time of the Muslim conquest of Spain as the golden era of Judaism, because the Jews were able to flourish amazingly. Most of their great scholars, for example, one of the largest scholars of Judaism, whose name is Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, he actually lived in that area at that time, and most of his major works were in Arabic.
Well, I suppose when you're living under non-oppressed conditions, you can get on with the things that you would want to do in life.
Indeed, and Al-Andalus became as much a place of Muslim learning as also Christian and Jewish learning. There were some areas where you'd have the Muslims who were in charge, you'd have an Amir who was Christian, and you'd have a mayor of the place who was Jewish. So everyone was really integrated well, and they were living in peace, essentially.
You've got Muslims, Christians and Jews all living together in peace.
Yes.
And I think there's something we've missed over history, isn't there?
We only need to look back and see, you know, how Islam...
Yeah, of course.
Any other system, you'll always find there are some errors, but the Muslims were the ones who truly brought peace and justice. They didn't compromise. They didn't, you know, force things upon others. They were happy to allow everyone to be happy and to let things run. And again, like...
the same attitude what we've got today, basically.
Yeah, of course, except we're not in power at the moment.
But if it was, that would be the situation. And not what a lot of people think, if the Muslims are in power, then we'd impose all these other restrictions on the people who don't buy into that system of beliefs.
Well, we only need to look again at history just to see how things did happen. We see the true times of peace, whether it be in Palestine or Spain or any other area, was when the Muslims had charge.
Well, I suppose this goes in the face of the argument that some people say that the Muslims ploughed on forward and spread Islam by the sword. It's simply not true. When you look at the people around the world, like for example in Indonesia, they don't look like Arabs, and they would have had that Arab look about them rather than the look of the native people had they have been taken over by the sword rather than accepting Islam. The evidence doesn't bear true to the accusation that some people say Islam was spread by the sword. It simply doesn't match up.
Indeed, of course, Indonesia especially, the Muslim traders, they came forward, they did their dealings, and they saw the upstanding righteousness of the Muslims.
That's right.
And they began to inquire about this. And the same happened within Spain. I mean, as we mentioned before, they saw that the Muslims were just, and they wanted them to come. And even many areas in Europe, they were inviting the Muslims to come forward. They said, please liberate us. Unfortunately, they weren't able to push all the way forward. Now, as well, when we look at Spain, it's amazing that this era is truly an era which is uncomparable to any other time in history. Europe at that time, or the non-Muslim Europe, Central Europe, was going through what was called the Dark Ages. Now, it's called the Dark Ages basically because the lights had went out. The Roman Empire had fallen, and Europe had fallen into an abyss. It was fallen into dismay.
That period is pretty much worldwide. That's called the Dark Ages. There was nobody following the religion as it was revealed.
And of course, arts-wise, education-wise, things had really fallen, and Europe was not central to the world anymore. But while the non-Muslim historians refer it to the Dark Ages of Europe, just in Western Europe, you had this amazing state of Andalus, of Muslim Spain. And out of there, you had cities like Cordoba. And Cordoba at that time was the largest city in the world. It was a city of 1 million people plus. If you look at the street of Cordoba, it was completely lit up. There were street lights, which was unknown in Europe. They had public baths, they had libraries, they had universities. People would travel all from around the world just to study in Andalus.
Wow.
And a true center of learning. So while you can say some of Europe was in the Dark Ages, another part of Europe, which is the Muslim area of Europe, it wasn't in a dark age at all. It was full of light. And you'll see when the Renaissance happened within Europe, and the Renaissance literally means the rebirth, it wasn't a rebirth from nothing. They had just taken everything from Andalus. If you look at Italy, all of their culture, all of the, the arts and so forth, they really just took it from the artisans of Muslim Spain.
And kind of like added bits to it, made it their own style, of course, yeah.
Yeah. So, of course, this rebirth wasn't something that was, from them themselves. They just learnt everything from the Muslims. And it was really the Muslims who took on the great works of the past. You'll see philosophy that was, really thriving in ancient Greece, kept through many of the Europeans. It was the Muslims who kept that going. Many of the, even the great Muslim scholars at that time, they added many additions to all of these works, medical-wise. I remember there's one doctor, he actually mentioned, he said, if you truly want to do justice in looking at the history of medicine, you must be able to speak the Arabic language. Because so many works were done in Muslim Spain covering all of these subjects.
World leaders at that time, yeah. This is the foundation of medicine of today. Go back to your natural history museums, look at the history of the development of the medical implements even, and see where the revolution took place.
Indeed. And of course it wasn't only just secular learning, but also Islamic learning. It's amazing when we do look at some of the stories which we hear of Andalus. The Muslims there were very, very educated. And one story which is recounted, it shows that not only were the men educated, but also the women. And this shows that the Ummah was really in a very good state. There's an account where the Khalifa, he was actually looking for a wife. He wanted to get married. So he said to the people of the city, he said, if you have a daughter who is at the age of getting married and she knows the whole Quran by heart, put a candle by your window tonight, so we'll know. And they said that night, the whole city was lit up. Wow. It was amazing. And this is just the women who were of the age of being married, maybe between 18 and 24, say. So there was that many. So the king, he said, or the Khalifa, he said, well, that's way too many to choose from. So he said, okay, the next night, if anyone has a daughter who's of marrying age, who knows the Quran by heart, and one of the major works of fiqh at that time, put a candle in your window. And while it wasn't the same amount as the night before, still there was a vast number.
What's amazing is, he gives the instruction, and the people listen.
Indeed. It was, the people were, of course, it wasn't a rebel state. It was very ordered. You had the Khalifa, you had the people.
Muslims for you. It should be, the Muslims, listen to the leader. Allah has put that leader over them, and they live within the Sharia, under that leader, and just aim for the best of what they can achieve.
And indeed at that time you'd see the rulers were quite just. Now there was two main peaks where the Muslim Ummah was threatened at this time. The first one happened about 300 years in. What happened was the Muslims who had stayed in that one area of Spain had really built themselves up. They'd been waiting all of this time. And finally they started to push forward. And they were really taking a lot of land. They would have had help from all of the Christians throughout Europe.
All the people that was happy to live under Muslim rule, knowing what it was.
Indeed. So the Christians were pushing down, and what had happened was the Khalifa, he knew that at that time the state wasn't very strong. Some of the people had fallen back. And if you look at the accounts in history, you'll see that wine drinking was prevalent. You'll see that Muslims were involved in statue making, dancing, music, all of these things which are forbidden by Islam. And once these are really thriving, and they weren't just happening in the homes, they were actually happening in the court of the Khalifa.
Wow, right from the top down.
Indeed. So when this is happening, you can sort of see that things aren't going as they should Islamically. Things had dropped down over time.
The people, they don't have themselves to blame. There's no complaining to Allah when they are behaving like that, and then they see the result over time.
Indeed, they'd only brought it upon themselves.
Yep.
Now,
the good things is from Allah, and the bad things are from ourselves.
What the Khalifa had decided at this time, he knew that were the Christians to push forward, they wouldn't really have a line of defense. So he thought he hasn't got anyone else in Europe to call upon to help him, because all of their neighbors were basically Christian and they all wanted to push down and defeat the Muslim empire. However, he looked beyond the Mediterranean, and there was a group of Muslims who were basically in what we'd know today as Morocco. Now these were very, very strong Muslims. They were very strong, sticking to Islam, unlike how the people had become in Andalus. So you can call them basically the modern Muslims that were in Andalus. They had sort of departed from most of the religion. So the Muslims who were the really practicing religions, they had a suspicion of them. They always liked to keep them out of Spain.
Right.
But at this time, in a time of need, the Khalifa had to make a decision. He said, either I can fight by myself and lose this land, or I can call upon the Muslims to come defend us. But he knew if the Muslims were to come through from northern Africa, they would also take the land, because they would come forward, they would defend the land, and it would be theirs after that.
But surely if they're Muslim, that's a better thing for
Of
them,
course.
because they know what it is. Even though many of the people were sinful, they must know deep in their hearts that it was wrong what it was doing.
And basically this was the decision he had to make. And there's an amazing saying that he said regarding this. He said, I would rather be herding camels than herding pigs. And basically the understanding of this was, when the Muslims come from Northern Africa, they're going to bring their camels, you know, the symbol of Arab and Islamic culture.
Sure.
But if the Christians come through, they're going to bring pigs. And we know as Muslims this is something which is not what we want.
No.
So he had to make this decision, and he made the right decision, which was to call upon the Muslims to come forward and to defend.
Alhamdulillah.
Now these Muslims who were from Northern Africa, they were called the Murabitun in Arabic. Now this word evolved in time in Spanish to become Almoravid. So if you read through the history books, you hear about the Almoravid era of Spain. And that's what we're looking at now. Now these people had come, and you would see, you know, they were very strong Muslims. They were, you know, visibly marked as Muslims, and what they would do, one thing which really stood out, was they would have their faces covered with only their eye showing, which was something which is, you know, very intimidating, especially on the battlefield. So they'd come forward, you know, these men from the desert, and they come and they really blitzed and they pushed the Christians back. And at this same time, it wasn't just the Christians that they were pushing back. It was also the Muslims which they were coming to put into line. You'll see many of the statues which were flourishing in the palaces at that time, you'll see that they had been defaced, not by the Christians but by the Muslims, because these Northern African Muslims come forward and they seen what was happening, and they smashed the bottles of wine. They defaced all of these statues. They come forward and, you know, they were destroying these places of wine drinking, and they were establishing mosques. So at this time we've seen there was a rebirth of Islam within the Iberian Peninsula. So for the next 400 years, again, the area was under Muslim hands. However, the Murabitun didn't always stay. They eventually drew back, and in time things changed again. And you had, you know, different groups within Spain, you know, the Arabs, you had the Turks, you had the Berbers, you had the locals, and feelings of nationalism and racism began to tear them apart.
That feeling of we're better than you for some reason.
Yes, unfortunately, again, it took over the Ummah, and again, you had the Muslims and they were fighting with each other. And this is one of the main lessons which you can really learn about the importance of unity and the effects of when you don't have that unity.
That's right. And as soon as you get the pride and arrogance, thinking we're better than them, that's the start of your downfall.
Indeed. What actually happened was when the Christians, again, after about 300-400 years, they had built themselves up again, and they started to push down, and the Muslim Empire was really shrinking to only the southern area of Spain. And what the Muslims were doing is, because they'd have so much enmity between each other, what they'd do is they'd go to the Christian king and queen at that time, and they would say, fight alongside us to help defeat this Muslim enemy. And so that's what would happen. The Christians would fight against that Muslim, and then once they defeated that Muslim, they'd turn on the Muslim who first came to them.
So it's kind of like divide and rule.
Indeed, and the Christians really exploited this, and unfortunately the Muslims fell for it. So while Spain was opened, it was actually first entered because of disunity amongst the Christians. It fell because of disunity amongst the Muslims.
Well, I guess maybe that's just human nature for you. Even though you're given the blueprint how to behave, people, sometimes they just can't help themselves. We are created sinful.
Unfortunately so.
And it just seems that we have these inclinations, and if we don't repent from our sin and correct our actions, we're in big trouble.
Indeed. And of course we have these commands to unite upon the Quran and the Sunnah, to unite upon Islam, to unite as one Jama'ah. We shouldn't tear ourselves amongst each other.
That's often not what you see today. It seems that we haven't learned from these lessons in the past. But there's so much wealth of how to reform ourselves.
So of course here we have an amazing example of just the importance of keeping united and not disuniting, because we see the perils and the effects of what might happen if this were to happen.
Allah's given us the blueprint how to behave, and we should stick to it.
Indeed. as Allah says, to keep united upon the Quran and the Sunnah. Unite as Muslims. Unite in this brotherhood, and do not
be divided.
And do not divide yourself. Otherwise, defeat is at hand.
And we can see it. Allah says it, and it comes true.
Indeed. So what had happened at this time, because the Muslims had been defeated, the Christians sort of put forward an ultimatum to them. You can either convert to Christianity, or you can be expelled from the peninsula.
Now that doesn't sound very fair. The Muslims go into the peninsula and let people have the freedom to choose their religion, yet when it's the other way around, it seems that actually it's the Muslims under compulsion to give up their religion, which of course they're not going to do.
Indeed, and of course many of them, where could they go to? I mean, their families have been there for 800 years. You're no longer a foreigner once you've been there for that long.
Yeah.
So originally many of them decided that of course they're not going to convert to Christianity, they're not going to give up their religion, even though they were in a pretty dismal state, still they had this pride in their belief. So most of them had decided to leave.
Or faith in their belief, that strong faith, they knew they was on the truth.
They were uncompromising.
That's right. Uncompromising with regard to Allah's rules, not uncompromising with regard to not getting on with people.
So at this time, many of the Muslims were migrating. They either went to Africa, Northern Africa, Morocco, to Algeria, to these areas. They would have maybe went to Turkey. A lot of them did go to Turkey. But then, strangely enough, you'd think that the Christians would be content that they were leaving. But they weren't happy with this. What they wanted was for them to stay there and either to remain in a very oppressed state or to embrace Christianity, under compulsion, of course. So Muslims were actually forbidden to leave after that point. And what came in this thing called the reconquest of Spain, you had a group called the Spanish Inquisition.
Oh my goodness.
And basically what the Spanish Inquisition was, they would come and they would be inquisitive. They'd ask you, what is your faith? And if you'd say that you were Muslim, they would basically say, you can either have the sword or you'll be baptized. Now in this time, many of the Muslims, because they were facing such a big fitna, they were facing such big tests, they'd contacted some of their scholars in Northern Africa and they say to them, what should we do? So they were advised by them to pretend to convert sometimes. They said if the pressure was too much and they can't do anything
for their life, if they really feel that somebody will pull the trigger or slash the sword, they're allowed to denounce their faith as long as they don't believe it in their heart.
So yes, of course they remain Muslims, but they just said, okay, whatever, just for the sake of their peace and security.
After the mercy of Allah, how He gives people a way out. They say there's no hardship in Islam.
Indeed.
Even in those situations, there's a way out, and maybe they'd find a way to migrate further from then.
Indeed.
I mean, if I was facing that kind of oppression, I would migrate. Someone's telling to me I don't have the freedom to practice my religion, you have to move.
And initially in this reconquest, what had happened was many of the Muslims were, getting baptized, and they'd say, yeah, we're Christian, whatever you want to call us. And they'd still continue to gather in their mosque, which now had a cross on top of it.
Right.
So it looked like a church, but they'd go in and they'd still pray.
Got it.
And so the Christians, it was a bit of a joke, like, the new Christians are in the mosque and they're praying Salat al-Asr. So in some time, there was one general at that time, and he was known as General Ximenes. And Ximenes was the one who really pushed for the strong part of the Inquisition, where basically, if you were a practicing Muslim, you could be put to the sword. And it got to a point where it was so extreme that if you had anything that showed a resemblance of being Muslim, you'd be put to the sword. For example, if people would be bathing on Thursday night or Friday morning, because it's Jummah time,
of a Muslim,
you'd be persecuted for this. And things had become so bad at that time. Again, they consulted their scholars. They said, well, we can't pray openly. What should we do? So the scholars would advise them, make tayammum, which is dry ablution. And they sometimes, because if you were to do it properly even, they would know that you're a Muslim. So they advise them to brush your hand on the wall, and that will suffice as your wudu. And rather than praying as you usually would, they say, continue walking through the marketplace as you would, but pray and prostrate with your eyes. This is amazing. The limitations that they had.
Even in that situation, Allah gives us a concession.
Of course, we see that still you did have those Muslims who wouldn't give up on their prayer.
Would you?
Of course not. A'udhu billah. Inshallah, we never would. But inshallah, we don't face this fitna either. It would be very understand the severity of being in such a situation, but they still kept steadfast. Now, ultimately, what had happened at that time, when Spain had been lost in 1492, the fall of Granada and Cordoba, and Andalus was lost. At that same time, it's very interesting that in 1492, as many people know, it's an important date, because this is when Columbus had sailed to the Americas. Now, it's still interesting because even though the Muslim Empire had fallen, you still had these Muslims there, the ones who were forced to convert, but they still kept Islam in their heart. And when Columbus had actually sailed forward to the Americas, most of, if not the majority of his, 99% of his crew were these people who were Muslims who were forced to convert.
Right.
Because you still had many of the artisans, who were Muslims on the inside. And what had happened when Columbus had reached the Americas, his main admiral, his main man on board of the ship, he actually rebelled against Columbus, and he declared a jihad against Columbus. And he said, you're an oppressive ruler of an oppressive nation, and we're Muslims, and you're not going to stop us. So he actually fought against him.
But again, jihad doesn't necessarily mean fighting. It means that struggle. And I guess the people in that oppressive situation, where they were saying they cared to follow their religion, but knew that if they did so, there was harm maybe for them. They sought advice from their learned scholars, alhamdulillah, and they got given the concession under that circumstances.
Of course, because really they faced destruction where if they showed any signs of Islam, they were amazingly discriminated against. They were standing up for their rights.
That was their jihad. That was their striving. That was their struggle. Yeah.
Indeed. So even until this time, Islam was still having an amazing influence in Spain. Now, after that, basically, we see the end of Andalus. Other areas of Europe at that same time also experienced a history of Islam in their area. And the part of Italy, where my father actually comes from, which is around Sicily and Calabria. And it helps to visualize Italy, they say that Italy is shaped like a boot. So if you go down towards the toe...
It's the island off the end of the toe.
The toe is Calabria, where we're from, and the island just off the toe, it's like the kicking the soccer ball. That soccer ball is Sicily, as they say. Now, what's interesting is Sicily was actually under Muslim control for almost 200 years. And Calabria and much of southern Italy was also under Muslim control for 100 to 150 years. So much of the same time that Andalus was under the rule of Muslims, you also had southern Italy under the control of other Muslims.
So maybe your far ancestors were Muslims.
Yeah, it's always a possibility.
Could be, yeah.
And it's amazing to look because if you do travel through that area, you don't see many visible signs of Islam. It's like it's almost completely disappeared. But yet through that time which the Muslims were in there was two languages spoken in Sicily, which was Arabic and Greek, because you had a Greek minority who continued to use their language there. And you'll find that they were the ones who were most rebellious towards Islam. But the local Italians, many, up to a quarter, if not half of the local Sicilian population, had become Muslim, that embraced Islam. And Arabic was their language. And even when the Norman invaders came and actually took Sicily after that 200-year reign, still Arabic was the official language of the island. And it continued to be for quite some time.
So the Muslims, they will never let go of the Arabic?
No, this is something...
When we say Assalamu alaikum, alaikum assalam, we will not give this up. And this is just the basics. But I mean, we are the new boys, probably always going to be the new boys for the next 10 years. But this is obviously, it should be every Muslim's intention, is to learn the Arabic, and it's part of this, which is going to, inshallah, help to unite us as an ummah.
Indeed, and of course at that time, the main books, the main centres of learning were all in Arabic.
Everything in Arabic, yeah, that's right.
So the local population felt an inclination and actually had this love for Arabic so much that they continued to use it after the Muslims had left.
If you want to be educated, and the books are in that language, you've got to go for it. Like, I guess a lot of Europe was doing, was heading for Latin.
Indeed, that was
in their books.
Indeed. It's interesting, around this time, this is something which I only actually discovered recently through researching this topic, that while the Muslims remained in southern Italy, they pushed up slowly, and they reached all the way until Rome. Now, as you would know, Rome is the heartland of Christianity and especially Catholicism. Yeah. You have St. Peter's Basilica, which is the main church of Christianity and Catholicism. It's basically like the Muslims have Mecca.
Exactly.
They have Rome. They have the Vatican.
Yeah.
Now, it's amazing that the Muslims actually pushed up all the way until Rome, and St. Peter's was actually sacked. The Muslims came in, and they could have taken the city. What happened? They came through, they sacked St. Peter's, they took the place, but then they pushed back down south. Now this, of course, was an attack on the heart of Christianity. And so the Christians saw this as an amazing thing, and they had to have a big response to it. So when the Normans came through, and the Normans were the French Vikings, if you like.
Yep.
They were the ones who came from Normandy in northern Europe, and they had come down during the Crusades mostly, and they had taken southern Italy from the Muslims. And so at that time, the people who were in Rome, also they sort of pushed out and sandwiched the Muslims almost. And what they did in an act of revenge, they said, before, from when you sacked our place, we're going to get you. And they took many of the prisoners and they forced them to build a wall that to this day stands around the Vatican. It's a very big wall and it's there to defend the place. So they said, you got us once and you're not going to get us again. But it's very, very interesting just to see how far Islam pushed into that area. Now at that time, as I mentioned, you had the Normans who were coming through that area, mostly because at that time the Crusades were happening. Now, anyone would have heard of the Crusades and exactly what it was. You had essentially the Holy Land, which was Palestine, which was central to Muslims, to Jews and to Christians.
We all lived in harmony there.
Indeed, they were living in harmony.
And it makes you wonder what so-called progress we have made.
Indeed. And again, we can learn lessons from this.
Yeah.
What had happened first off, the Muslims were controlling this area, and the Christians, they felt threatened. They felt threatened, and they also saw an opportunity for trade and business there. So on the pretense of saying that what we see as our holy land, we see you might be desecrating it, or you're stopping pilgrims from coming in, which by the most part was not true, because the Seljuk Turks who were there at the time, they allowed many people in. If anything did happen, it might have been a few minor incidents, nothing to start a massive war over. So what had happened is, they said, we want our holy land. The Muslims said, you're not having it. And this war happened. And it culminated into what we know as the Crusades. So the Christians pushed forward, and all of these forces of Europe, you had the Pope rallying behind them. He said, these people, these uncivilized barbarians, they've taken our land and we've got to come and liberate it. Little did he know, of course, the Muslims were the ones who were the utmost, they were the most educated people. You had all of these lies which really were born throughout the Crusades, because the people of Europe were quite ignorant at that time.
So right back then, you got people saying to the Christians, oh, we know about the Muslims and they're barbarians.
Yeah, and of course.
And we must be scared of them and fight against them. And people would say, of course we want to defend our land.
Mm. And of course,
it seems like not a lot has changed in that respect, in terms of the lies and the misconceptions.
And indeed, it was far from the truth. The Muslims were nothing like that.
As is now.
Yes, but the Christians were easy to fall for. The Europeans didn't know too much. So once they had actually came there, you would see a lot of them, they said, we're willing to go on this crusade. And of course, crusade, it comes from the word cross, the Latin word for cross, crux. So they were fighting a war to establish the cross in that land. And they had come with all of and they're willing to leave their families, to leave their homes, to travel all the way to the Holy Land, only to get there and sort of say, hey, this enemy that we're supposed to be fighting, they're actually some quite good guys. And what's amazing, even in the First Crusade, many of the people who had actually come to so-called liberate the Holy Land went there and they embraced Islam.
Alhamdulillah.
There are numerous accounts of these Christians coming there, seeing how the Muslims were, and joining them. This is something which is truly amazing.
When you have something that you think is the best,
only to find something better.
And then you find something better, how shocked would you be?
Indeed. Now, at this time, if we look at the Muslim response, another lesson that we can learn, if your land was invaded, these people have come and they've taken it forcefully off you, it's your right, it's your duty to resist that.
Yep.
Because you don't want to be expelled from your homes. You have to fight against that, or justice. Now, what had initially happened is the Muslims at that time, for whatever reason, they didn't see so much of a problem with this. They'd been expelled from their homes, but they also saw it as an opportunity to do some trade with the Christians. Wow. And so when the First Crusade happened, most of the Muslims pretty much threw up their hands and said, well, it's happened, let's make the most of it. So you had actually many Muslim scholars at that time writing books. And it's amazing to see something like this. Because when we look at the Crusades, it's undoubtedly a state of a big war that was happening. But initially, these books were written to tell the Muslims, you're actually being invaded by these foreign invaders, and you're in a state of jihad, you must fight. Because the Muslims didn't believe it. They said, no, we're happy, we're content to be conquered. There's no problem with this.
Again, it's the people's mistake. Maybe after they've united and resisted and says, we're not standing for this. As I'm sure anybody in the world, somebody coming to their place, killing their family members, their friends, their neighbours, could you just sit back and do nothing? Could you, under the pretense of trade, say, yes, we'll deal with these people? Could you do it?
You wouldn't imagine so.
I don't think many people could, but it's happening today, still.
And for whatever reason, it did happen at that time with the Muslims. They allowed this to happen. And it wasn't for at least another 50 to 100 years where the Muslims, a bit of a late start, like we see amongst a lot of Muslims these times. You know, tell them to do something at this time, and they get it done a lot later.
So 50 years later, they kind of woke up to the fact that, okay, this is not, we didn't react in the right way. Maybe it was written for their children to have the rewards of following the religion properly.
Indeed. And we would say at this time, again, people were really returning to Islam, and so they began to wake up. And what's another important lesson to learn at this time? Amongst the Muslims, when they began to unite amongst themselves, there was still some disunity. People were sort of vying for power still. You had in Egypt these power struggles. You know, they all wanted to liberate the Ummah, but they didn't want their brother to do it. They wanted to be the ones who were doing it. So you had, you know, they were really competing against each other, and they were killing each other even. And of course, this isn't what you want.
So
if you want to be
Muslim killing Muslim.
Yes.
And again, you've got the same thing happening today.
Unfortunately,
we haven't learned much.
So at this time, you had a few main forces, and one name which will come up, which many people would know, is that of Salahuddin. Now Salahuddin, you'll also hear him referred to in the West as Saladin, but hereforth we'll refer to him as Salahuddin by his Arabic name.
Sure.
Salahuddin, he was actually a young commander at that time, and his commander, his senior, was known as Nuruddin Zanki. Nuruddin, if you read through the Islamic text, was an amazing man. He was a scholar. He was known for his, utmost piety. An amazing man. Eventually, Nuruddin had died, and Salahuddin was able to take over. Salahuddin had therefore taken charge of the Ummah, and the unity which was, really prepared before him was finalized, and so the Muslims were able to give their response. So you had the Christians who had taken the Holy Land of Palestine, and Jerusalem had been taken by the Christians, and the Muslims were pushing up forward. And once the Muslims had finally united, all of their forces, despite the fact that they were slaughtered, like an amazing, amazing slaughter had happened before, once they truly united, they actually pushed through the Holy Land in a number of days. And in about 3 days, they had reached Hattin, they had reached Jerusalem, and they were at the gates. And the Christians were amazed. And you had, at that time, Richard the Lionheart, who was leading the Christians. And although him and Salahuddin never actually met at all, they were leading these two armies, and they were always in correspondence. And they were almost best of friends. Like when Richard the Lionheart was sick, Salahuddin sent some of his physicians to look after him. He gave him his best physicians. So even though they were opposed to each other, they were two leaders of opposing armies, they still had these etiquettes. They had that respect. And this is part of the reasons why the Europeans do have such a respect for him, because he did have these Islamic morals.
I think things have gone downhill from there, with one military leader to another from that time.
Indeed, we haven't got much to replace what we had back then.
No, not at all.
Now, when the Muslims had reached Jerusalem, they got to the gates, and these two armies met, and the Muslims easily defeated the Christians. And what had happened was, now that the Christians were defeated, they expected for them to receive the same punishment that they had handed out to the Muslims. But Salahuddin, out of his mercy, he said, "You're free, you can go. We're not barbaric like you. You come here claiming we were those barbaric people, but you'll see that that's far from the truth." So these people, they went back to Europe with these great stories of, this just ruler, Salahuddin, and how just the Muslims were. And so for quite some time after that, there was no immediate response.
That's a powerful dawah. When you see what the people do when they have the power to be in control, and out of their mercy, let people live in harmony, let people live free from oppression.
Indeed. So after this, this was what we'd call the Third and the Fourth Crusades, where the Christians were trying to again reclaim Jerusalem, but they failed. Now, there were a few other crusades after this, and what's interesting, at the end of those crusades, the Christians had actually teamed up, they had joined forces with an army that had been coming from the east. And this is what we know as the Mongols, under Genghis Khan, who were pushing forward. And this is where, if you call the Crusades a sort of prelude to the much bigger battle which was at hand. So the European Christians had come in, they'd lost, they got to go home, think about what had gone wrong, and plan for the future. But for the Muslims, there was no rest. What was facing them was much more immense, and that was the invasion of the Mongols. Now what happened was, Genghis Khan, he founded the Mongolian Empire, which is just north of China, and he started to push through Central Asia, taking Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, all of these areas that we know. And they basically just rolled through amazingly easy. This was a force which was never seen probably in history, just the power that they had. And so once they had taken Central Asia, they met with the Muslims. And at that time, the Muslim Empire, the capital of the Muslim Empire was in Baghdad, in Iraq. Now once the Mongols had came into Baghdad, if you hear the accounts of just what happened,
I bet they couldn't believe it.
it was to have such this army, amazing horde coming through, smashing everything, having no mercy. They actually said the libraries of Baghdad containing all of these amazing Islamic texts were thrown into the rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, and they said the ink of the books had turned the rivers black, and all of this amazing wealth of knowledge was lost. They ransacked the place, they had no mercy. And do you see even the Khalifa at that time, he was killed, and the Mongolians, they had believed very strongly in certain superstitions. And one of the such things, Genghis Khan was advised by his astrologer. He said, this man that you have here, this Khalifa, is a special man, and his blood is not allowed to touch the ground. But of course,
when he heard he'd been killed,
Genghis Khan,
he believed in his horoscope. Of course, this is forbidden for Muslims.
Of course, definitely, it's not something we indulge in.
In the future, like dealing in these cards, were totally forbidden.
But Genghis Khan, he wanted to find a loophole to this. So even though he believed in this astrology, he still wanted the Khalifa killed. So what he actually had done, to ensure that his blood didn't drop on the ground, they had him rolled up into a carpet pulling on top of him. So his blood didn't spill onto the ground, but at the same time he was killed. So we see there was no mercy at the hands of these people. And they continued to push forward, taking all of these Muslim lands. So while you still had the Crusades, really finishing off on the west, you had the Mongols coming from the east.
No rest for the Muslims.
Definitely not. But yet at this same time, the Crusades had lasted for at least 100 or so years. And the Muslims had learned from all of these things, and out from there were growing great Muslim scholars. Like at this time we had Ibn Taymiyyah, who's one of the greatest scholars of Islamic history, rahimahullah. And he was at that time. And he wasn't just a scholar who, would sit down and write books all day. He actually actively took part. He led armies to meet this Mongol force. So we see, it's amazing that we had scholars of that time, and they were really active. They would actually practice what they preached. They would get out there and they would lead the armies.
Wow, that's high caliber sort of potential people there. High caliber people.
Inshallah, we have many more such scholars coming at this time.
Inshallah.
So what had happened was the Mongols were pushing forward, and there was no defense for the Muslims. The army that was facing them was immense. And it was the Mamluks of Egypt who decided to push forward and to meet them. Now the Mamluks, literally Mamluk in Egypt means the one who is controlled over. And that's what it means in Arabic, because literally the Mamluk Empire were a people who were originally slaves. And they had gone from being slaves to being the rulers of Egypt at that time. And they were a very strong Muslim people. Now what these people did is they met forward, and they met at a place called Ain Jalut. And the Battle of Ain Jalut is very well known exactly what happened there. As we talked about before in Andalus, where you had that battle between the Muslims and the Christians, and that was, had of the Muslims pushed forward, that would have been the end. In the same way, had of the Mongols pushed forward after this battle, basically the Muslim Empire would have been left open to defeat. So this was a very important battle, a very crucial battle. And the Muslims met them, and there was a massive defeat. The Mongols were humiliated. And what's interesting
they
here...
couldn't believe it.
No.
They swept across Asia and then defeated.
All of a sudden, yes, they meet this force which they could not penetrate. So usually what would happen if you'd been defeated, you'd push back a bit. You'd go back, you'd regroup, you'd rethink your strategy. But what happened here is really unprecedented in history. The Mongols, who had come forward, making all of this land, building a massive empire, as soon as they saw defeat at the hand of the Muslims, 3 out of the 4 Mongol tribes embraced Islam.
That's
3/4 of their army.
They just had a battle, and then 3/4 of them, or 3 out of 4, maybe they're not equal portions, embraced Islam.
Indeed.
Maybe they saw things in the battle that made them raise their awareness of just what barbarians they were.
Indeed.
The Mongols at the time.
Yeah. And historians look at this and they try to find traces, getting a hint of why this happened, why these Mongol invaders decided to embrace Islam so abruptly, so quickly. And there's really nothing that they can find, so it must have been that. They would have seen the character of the Muslims. Upon their defeat, they would have been looked after, they would have been treated justly, and the Muslims would have had a chance to give the da'wah, to tell them about Islam, and they would have been happy to accept.
For example, when Muslims took prisoners, they would look after them. Yeah, maybe the prisoners would work for them. If they was knowledgeable in something, they would teach their children maybe another language or something. This is the way to treat prisoners. They would perhaps eat the same food as what their captors would eat.
And there was no injustice upon them. So yeah, we've got numerous accounts of this, so we can assume that the Mongol invaders, this was something which they would have seen. And to this day, you see all of these Central Asian countries, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, they're still some of the strong, real flag bearers of Islam. And it's because of this. So while they had aimed to defeat Islam and to defeat the Muslims, rather they were the ones, they weren't defeated because they embraced Islam, and they achieved success along with the Muslims.
Alhamdulillah.
And it's interesting to look as well, because as I mentioned, the Mamluks, essentially, they were originally slaves. They were people who were subjugated. But look at where Islam brought them, the status that it brought them. We only need to look at the stories of the companions, people like Bilal, may Allah be pleased with him, or Wahshi, at the same time, may Allah be pleased with him. These were people who began as slaves to the Meccan idolaters.
That's right.
But once Islam came, they stuck to the message of Islam. They were uncompromising. They said, we're not going to trade our belief in Allah for anything else.
And persecuted heavily for it.
Indeed.
Like rocks on their chest.
And so we see someone like Bilal, after Islam was established and Mecca was conquered, we see Bilal was actually made as the governor of Syria. So he'd gone from being
a slave to the governor of a country.
Indeed, look at the status which Islam brought someone like this.
It just goes to show that it's not lip service. When people talk about equality in Islam, it's like everybody is equal in Islam, only differentiated by our piety.
Indeed.
And obviously, Bilal, alhamdulillah, was made of the right stuff.
Alhamdulillah. So the same thing happened with these Mamluks, going from being slaves to being people who are really fighting for Islam, who are upholding Islam. So we see the status which Islam really brings to such people as Bilal. So we see the status which Islam has given to people who had gone from being slaves, like Bilal, may Allah be pleased with him, to being in roles such as governors.
Yeah. It's not just lip service, it's for real.
Also, another example we see, which is a prime example, because it's not from just anyone, it's from the companions of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So another one of such people was the story of Wahshi ibn Harb. Now, Wahshi, you hear the name Wahshi, in Arabic literally it means like the beast, Wahsh. So it's a very harsh name. So we see this man he was also a very harsh man. And it's well known throughout Islamic history that during one of the battles that the companions were fighting against the Mushrikeen of Mecca, this man Wahshi was actually employed by Hind. Now Hind was the wife of Abu Sufyan, who at that time was one of the biggest enemies of Islam.
Staunch enemy. Yeah.
He was one of the ones who was really leading the fight against the message of Islam spreading. Now Hind had got this man who was one of the slaves of the idolaters of Mecca, and she said to him, I want you to kill Hamza, who was the uncle of the Prophet. And so she got Wahshi. He was really trained on this mission, and they got out to the battlefield. And Wahshi, he had with him a spear, and he used this spear to kill the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ, who was Hamza, may Allah be pleased with him. And so this man, initially he was someone who fought against Islam. However, this was what he was being forced to do. Once he'd actually seen what the message of Islam was, he actually embraced Islam, which is amazing. This man, also, first off, he was an enemy to the Muslims, and then once he'd seen the truth of Islam, he joined the Muslims. Just like Bilal, going from a slave, who were both Abyssinian, both Ethiopian, to becoming Muslims. With the story of Wahshi, may Allah be pleased with him, we see that once he had embraced Islam, when the Prophet heard about this, he didn't want to see Wahshi face to face, because the grief was still close to him, was something very harsh for him. This was the man who had killed his uncle. So what the Prophet commanded was that when Wahshi was there, he didn't want to see him. Now this was the command of the Prophet, and Wahshi, as a Muslim, he was happy with this. So it was for him that whenever the Prophet was there, he would always try his best to leave that area, because he didn't want to upset the Prophet. And he did this until the death of the Prophet ﷺ. So what had happened, once the Prophet had died, we've seen Wahshi was someone who really, he showed his true colors. He showed his dedication to Islam. At that time, there was a man who was a false prophet, who was known as Musaylama al-Kadhab, Musaylama the liar.
The liar.
This was a man who was claiming that he was a prophet. And even at the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, they actually had interaction with each other.
Correspondence, yeah.
They had a correspondence. And you've seen just how absurd this message that this man was bringing. he'd try and send verses that were imitating the Quran, for example. And we see the Quran is eloquent, whereas what he was bringing was something which was really mundane and absurd.
And with a bad meaning.
Yes, like,
not a good meaning at all, yeah.
It wasn't something that, you can see why his followers were so small, because what he was really bringing wasn't something that was fruitful. So Wahshi, may Allah be pleased with him, he said, this man, I'm going to take him. And this would almost be his ransom. For having killed Hamza, he wanted to use this as a way to compensate. So
like penance.
As a penance, yes.
Yeah.
So once the Muslims met with Musaylama on the battlefield, Wahshi, with that very same spear that he had used to kill one of the best of creation, he used to kill one of the worst of creation. And this was his statement. He said, this same spear was used for this purpose. Now I have used it to destroy one of the worst of creation. And again, we see someone who had been a slave to being put into one of the highest positions. So Islam really brings that honor to the people.
I think a lot of people have got the misconception about Islam in that it speaks of slaves and thinks, oh yes, the Muslims, they want to enslave everybody and treat them as like second-class citizens. Yet in reality, the Muslims at the time, when they had slaves, you couldn't tell who was the owner and who was the slave. They had the same clothing. They ate from the same food, from the same plate often. Similar accommodation. You don't know who is the boss and who is the slave.
Indeed, and Allah really stresses in the Quran, the reward of someone who frees a slave. So while it was something that it's permissible, at the same time you're told to show honor for these people.
Yep. And
you'll hear many accounts, like when the Prophet ﷺ came across a slave woman, he said to her, where is Allah? And she said, Fis sama, in the heavens. And he said, free her, for she is a believer. Look at that mercy. Just because she showed that she was a true believer in Islam, she was given freedom from this.
Yeah.
Indeed. So this is really the justice, the freedom which Islam comes to bring to this.
I think a lot of the non-Muslims are not aware of these kind of situations. They're given like a different version of events, which is frankly not consistent with the authentic history books.
And whilst you might see it might be related in history that certain actions had happened, we can't replace what happened on behalf of someone, what actually happened with the Prophet and his companions, because they are the ones who are our role models. And if someone else is falling short, it doesn't mean that Islam is falling short.
Exactly, it's their sin, it's their mistake, and they're accountable to God for it on the Day of Judgment.
Another thing which would be good to look at is the conquering of Constantinople, which we know today as Istanbul. It's truly an amazing story of how this area came and Islam was brought to it. Because originally this area, which is in modern-day Turkey, was part of what was called the Roman Empire. It would be good to go into more detail if we had all of the proper resources to do justice to it. But unfortunately, we're not able to go into it in all of that detail.
Not in this time scale.
For those who could go off and to read about this conquering, it would be an amazing experience for them just to see how beautiful it was once they had captured this city.
Alhamdulillah. I think you've given the head start to them just to know where to start their continuation of the studies.
It would definitely be good to continue on from here. And of course we know studying our history is something which is amazingly important because there's so many lessons to be learned from it. History, as Ibn Khaldun, who was one of the Muslim historiographers, he said, history is constantly repeating itself.
That's right.
It has a cyclical nature. So it happens once, and we see it's happening yet again and again and again. But are we learning the lessons from it? Will we take the good and use it again? Will we look at where we went wrong, and will we learn from it? And of course, that's what we hope to do in this, not just to increase our knowledge. Because there are many very inspiring stories. Like if we look at Surah Al-Fil in the Quran, another case in history, where what had happened, Abraha had wanted, was for Qulais to become a place of pilgrimage for the people of the Arabian Peninsula. The problem, however, they already had a place of pilgrimage,
of course,
which was to Mecca, to the Kaaba in Mecca, which was built by the Prophet Ibrahim and his son Ismail alayhim as-salam. So he had a problem on his hands. Whilst he was calling the people to come make pilgrimage to his church, the Qulais, you had already a place that they were going to. You would see Abraha, he wasn't too happy with Mecca because it was, an opposition to what he had built.
Right.
Now, at this time, he had sent his own emissary to go to the Arabs and tell them, make pilgrimage to my church instead of the Kaaba in Mecca. Now, what had happened was when they had heard about this, they actually killed the emissary. They were so, outraged at such a proposition, they killed him. And even later, some of the Arabs came down and they tried to destroy the Qulais. So Abraha, he's built this big church and people are defecating it, they're trying to destroy it. It really ticked him off. So he decided that he was going to march onto Mecca and to destroy the Kaaba. And this story, it's actually related in the Quran, in Surah Al-Fil, the chapter of the elephant. And we know that from Islamic history, this is actually the same year that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was born, in the year of the elephant. So what happened was Abraha, and this is where the name of the elephant comes, he brought big elephants with him when he marched onto Mecca. And at that time, elephants had never been used, not in Arabia. This was the first time that the Arabs were seeing elephants. So you could compare them to army tanks, if you like, seeing these big things marching towards your land. So when the Arabs heard about this, the Quraysh, the people of Mecca, they were frightened, because they said, wow, there's such a big army coming forward, and they all fled to the mountains. So basically Mecca was undefended by the people. And when Abraha had continued marching forward, he actually encountered the grandfather of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, who was Abdul Muttalib. He saw Abdul Muttalib, and he said to him, aren't you going to defend your place? Because he was, with some of his sheep, he was a shepherd. And he said, I'm going to look after my sheep. I'm going to go and look after them, and Allah will look after what is His. So even though he wasn't a Muslim, he still understood that the Kaaba was Allah's, and therefore Allah would defend it. So whilst the people had abandoned it, and Wahshi was marching forward with this grand army which was never really seen before in size and power, Allah would be the one who would defend the place for them. And so once the army started to march forward, it's narrated in this story in Surah Al-Fil of the Quran. It's only a short chapter of the Quran that retells what had happened. They had started to march forward, and what happened was the elephants refused to go past the borders of Mecca. And these borders of Mecca, if you read through the ahadith, actually they were set by the angel Jibreel alayhi salam. Jibreel alayhi salam came down to Ibrahim alayhi salam and said to him specific points which would be the borders of Mecca. That's the haram area, the protected holy area. The elephant would not march forth past there. And so the elephant, each time they'd go past, he would turn around. And they'd try and trick the elephant by turning him around a few times so he wouldn't know where he was, but he still would not pass that specific area. So the army decided to march forward without their elephants. And at that time, Allah sent down a flock of birds. And what these birds did is that each one of them had a stone with them. And if you read through the tafsir, it says these stones were no bigger than a chickpea. They were actually very, very small in size. So you'd think, what would something that small do? But with the power of Allah, this is able to happen.
Of course.
So these birds had came down, and each one of these stones had a name written on it, which was the name of the person on which it would be dropped on. And what the birds would do, some of them, when they would send down these stones, it would hit the people and it would explode. And one sheikh, he was narrating this story and he said, this is the first time in history we see bombs being used. And you think about it, this is the first time that it really happened. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is able to do this. And some of these rocks, what would happen is it would pass through the person's body, and once it was inside it would explode. And another type, it would pass through the person's body and split them, and the person would die. And so this army was completely ravaged. They were completely destroyed. So whilst they had gone to try and destroy the Kaaba and to go against Allah's house, Allah had defended His place. Now, one of the lessons that we see from this story, one of the companions had narrated that the Khalifa Uthman, may Allah be pleased with him, within his own personal mushaf that he kept with him, the surah of Surah Al-Fil and the following surah, Surah Quraysh, were actually one and the same surah he kept, because their meaning is so close together. We see at the first, Allah has protected His place, which is the Kaaba, where the Quraysh were. In the following surah, He says to the people of Quraysh, فَعَبْدُوا رَابَ هَذَا الْبَيْتِ, worship the Lord of the Bayt, of the house. So you see that Allah is giving you all of these favors. Even though you were not able to defend your place, you were not able to defend your homes, Allah has protected it for you. So therefore, be thankful and worship Allah.
Jazakallah, Brother Musa. It's very informative, and inshallah, maybe we'll learn some lessons from the past, and inshallah, maybe people will learn from this and start to apply them for the future, inshallah. Jazakallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, brothers and sisters. Jazakallah. Assalamu alaikum.